My name's Helen Carter. Obviously, I work for Action Sustainability, and I'm going to focus specifically today on procurement. That's my background. I've been in procurement for quite a few decades, and probably been looking at modern slavery in relation to this for the last 8 years or so. So really going to give you some insights into some of the things that I'm seeing from our clients and from industry in general. So as always, the usual rules apply. This is a webinar, so if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the questions and answers section, and I will keep my eye on that as we're going through. The chat will be disabled, so you won't be able to sort of put anything in the chat as such, but you will see details in there relating to the Menti codes, for example, so please keep your eye on that when we come to do that session. As with all the others, the webinar is being recorded, so you will get access to that later on, and also we will be distributing all the slides. So all of this will come out to you next week, along with sort of feedbacks and information on what we do within AS. So Action Sustainability, if you're not familiar with us, is a small, smallish actually, rather than small, we've grown a bit over the last few years, consultancy that looks specifically at sustainable procurement. That's our heritage, that's what we've done, and we've been part of lots of committees and authorships in sort of leading edge thinking around sustainable procurement, in particular ISO 2400 being the main element, where we were part of the author panel for that. But we also do the area that I'm in charge of, which is modern slavery and human rights, social value, energy and carbon. In fact, I'm actually competing with my colleague today. He's doing a carbon webinar, e-learning, measurement, anything really that's trying to drive sustainable practices into supply chains. So the team you should be familiar with now if you've been on with us all week. If you are new to the group, then this is the team. It started off with me as modern slavery a few years ago, and we've now grown it, which is brilliant, to some brilliantly passionate people like myself on this area. So I lead the modern slavery and human rights area. EJ, I'm a Jane, but we call her EJ, and she prefers to be called EJ. Anna, who you would have seen yesterday, and Sam, who is our researcher who's developing in this space. We've supported businesses probably for the last sort of 5 or 6 years in this area around modern slavery and human rights and supply chains. We also support something called the Supply Chain Sustainability School. So if you are familiar with that and are in the built environment, you may see me with a different background sometimes doing training in that space. But we've done everything from training to evaluations to guidance documents to actually supporting supplier management audits, risk assessment, a huge range. And I'll go through that support tomorrow when we've really gone through the whole focus as we go through. As I've mentioned, we were on the authoring panel. I spent 2.5 years of my life with some absolutely brilliant colleagues pulling together the new BS 25700 standard, and I was working with Akila on developing the procurement element. So today is really about supporting all the elements in procurement on what you should be thinking about in your supply chain, and everything, as we have done with the last 4 days, really contributes towards how you think about implementing the British standard, which is free, by the way. It's not very often you hear that, is it? A standard that's free. But BSI was so passionate about ensuring that this standard was available to everybody so that we could make a difference. They made it freely available. So the links to that will be available as well when we send out slides. But do go and have a look, because you can literally print it off and read it today if you wanted to, if you haven't done it already. We've designed this week to really take you through a huge range of issues that relate to modern slavery, hopefully trying to unfurl, open up the flower a little bit and make you realise that addressing modern slavery is a little bit more complex than just a compliance issue. So we've obviously taken you through policy, we've taken you through how to set up your organisation. Anna yesterday was doing work on the risk mapping and supply chain mapping, and today I'm going to build further on that. And these 4 days will really give you the sort of hows, if you like, to think about that support things like that standard, but best practice in this space. I'll finish off by explaining today, by explaining what we're going to do tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be a little bit different in as much as we're going to be looking much more about how modern slavery fits in a business, how it fits with other aspects, and I'll give you a bit more information about that a little bit later on. So without further ado, we'll get into the nuts and bolts. As we have done with all of the weeks so far, we are going to start with a Menti poll. So if you can, and Gemma's very kindly put the code into the chat for me, if you can get your Menti polls out, you should be well versed to this if you've been with us all week. Excuse me. And you can see the code online. It's 19540256. And what I'd like to know from you before we sort of start today is what sort of supply chain due diligence activity have you got in place in your organisation? So you can choose numbers, a large number of them, lots of different types included. Some people have it in the policy, as we started off talking about that. Some have done risk assessment, some have done mapping, some go for the PQQs and ITTs, auditing, training, supplier management, industry engagement and collaboration. Nothing as of yet. So if you can start to sort of give me an insight into what activity you've been taking, that would be really good. Is the scale where one end is more mature than the other? I'll give you an insight into that in a moment, so bear with me when I start to have a look. So the process that we're going to go through today is that procurement due diligence, the procurement activity that you need to put in place. And actually, we've got a question in the Q&A session already looking specifically at whether there is a maturity, and we do see some maturity in this space. So it isn't a scale of maturity from one end to the other, it's a list of activities. But if I was to say that I see clients regularly coming to me and asking, Helen, can I have an ITT question? Can I have a PQQ question? Pre-qualification, Maria, and invitation to tender, their procurement terms. So can you give me a question that I can put into my tender? Have you got a question I can ask my supplier what they're doing in this space? And that's usually the first start that most organisations go on to. What we start to see in terms of maturity is where we then get the risk assessment approach, the mapping approach. Is brilliant that there's policy, and that's really driven by the transparency requirements. But it's not surprising that the auditing, the training, supply management are sort of lower in scores at the moment, because that really does indicate a much more comprehensive approach to how we address modern slavery. So most organisations start with a quick policy. They start with some questions in tenders, maybe some questions in pre-qualifications, maybe a bit of auditing, but I'll show you in a moment the whole process that should be considered when we go through. Okay, brilliant, thank you. So, have you ever asked your supply chain to provide sourcing information on key products to support your transparency requirements? Yes, no, don't know. So this is very much about asking your suppliers what they do. Have they got any auditing processes, any procurement processes? Do they know country of origin? This is information that we need, procurement teams need to start asking going forward. And most organisations will start probably with tier 1 and then move into tier 2, as you heard from Nikki yesterday. She was talking about that sort of step-by-step approach in terms of embedding requirements further and further into the supply chain. So from the people that have been answering that question, great. A large percentage of you have got the yes going. So you're starting that conversation, which is brilliant. The no, we'll dive a little bit later into whether that no is a you don't need to, or whether that's a no because you're not really sure what to ask. So we'll have a look. And don't know, yes, not sure. It depends if we've got procurement people or a mix on the call. Okay. When we start to look at due diligence and supply chain mapping and procurement activities, we hear a lot from organisations that it's difficult. But why? If you're looking to embed due diligence, and you're obviously here to learn some tips, and I've been here all week to think about some of the things that you need to consider, what have been the challenges that you have experienced in your organisation when you're thinking about this sort of supply chain transparency requirements? It's a word cloud like some of the others, so just pop some of the key words and key challenges that you're experiencing in trying to embed due diligence. Resource. Yeah, it's always a difficult one with how many people you've got, whose role and responsibility is. It's always a difficult one as well. Number of supply chain partners. Yeah, I've seen organisations where I've had their risk data or their supply chain data given to me to help with a risk assessment, and I could be looking at 1,000 lines of suppliers and categories. huge number, and then if you multiply that underneath, it's a huge number again. So it is not a quick and easy job to do. Internal understanding and engagement, yep, definitely in procurement we have a real mixed bag of people understanding this, and actually, because procurement is a commercial function, understanding beyond commercial, what else needs to be added, whether it's social value, carbon, or modern slavery. Resources is always challenged. Talking as a professional procurement person, it's never enough of us. But you need to think about that in terms of auditing as well, in terms of how we do this. Too ad hoc, yes, there isn't a consistent approach to it. Complicated, yes. I mean, what I'm going to give you at the moment is going to help, but I can't tell you it's a quick, easy tick box exercise. I would be lying if I said that was the case. So it is needing a much more sort of sophisticated approach that maybe some organisations are actually ready for. Okay, so one way that organisations think about this stuff is by thinking about responsible sourcing standards, and I can see a variety of people, some I know, some I don't, so I'm not familiar with all the industries that you're in, but some have responsible sourcing standards. There is things like FSC, fair trade, you've got Rainforest Alliance, which is very much in that sort of FMCG perspective. In the built environment, you have things like CARES and BS 6001. There are standards out there, and I'll talk very briefly this afternoon about some of those. And it is a way to help with some of that due diligence. It doesn't replace it. So do you have any that you're using? So it looks like we have a few, which is good. And again, depending on your role in the organisation, you may not know, but this is really important when we not just think about procurement, but when we're specifying our goods, when we're thinking about what it is we want to purchase, we have a great opportunity to think about some of those standards at that point. And then, can you give me an example of some of the standards that you're using? So those of you that said yes, can you think of any or examples that you do use in what you're looking for? So are there any particular ones that resonate with you? FSC, yeah, and FSC is probably one of the few that is actually a really good balanced responsible sourcing standard. FSC as a responsible sourcing standard for something like timber, paper products, has almost like the triple perspective. It looks at social, human rights, Indigenous rights, training and stakeholders, but it does also look at stewardship, economic, sort of stakeholder engagement and economic ownership of a lot of the timber areas. So FSC is a really good one. Fair trade is obviously one that you may be personally familiar with. Furry, okay, interesting. Coffee Alliance, yeah, that's another one that's being used in the coffee procurement. Excuse me, there's a lot of work going on in that space. SMETA are audits, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. Okay. Right, thank you for that. A little bit of insight as to what your information is and what you're currently doing. So let's get on to the meat of what we're thinking about. We've already talked extensively over the last sort of 3 or 4 days about why supply chains. I could probably put 5 or 6 slides like this together at the moment on exposés, organisations, products that are permeating through our supply chain that have links to forced labour and human rights breaches. We know that supply chains now, one of the key things we're seeing in terms of organisation pressure is legislation, ESG, reputational issues and resilience. And Nikki talked really well about that yesterday, about understanding what's going on in your supply chain from a business resilience perspective. And yeah, it's one of those key things that we need to think about. The link to all of this is supply chains. We have never seen, I started working in sustainable procurement about 20 years ago, and we were trying to get people to think about their supply chains. And from a sustainability perspective, organisations have considered their own opinion very much, what they do, their own operations, and parcelled off supply chains as, well, we just contract with them. That's no longer something that we can get away with. So we need to have a think now more than ever about what we do within our supply chains. But one of the things I see a lot with clients that I work with in this space is actually considering the concept of supply chains. So I've worked and done lots and lots of, way too many webinars sometimes, and done speaking slots and worked with clients where they've gone, yeah, we've mapped our supply chain, we know exactly what we've got, where it is. And when you look at it, they know what their tier 1 suppliers are, but they don't think about supply chain in its purest chain. So when we understand what we need to do in procurement, it's very much about ensuring we understand where forced labour sits in the entire supply chain. And then we need to think about what Anna was talking about yesterday, how we start to identify, prioritise and assess what our role and responsibility is for addressing that in the procurement process. So if we look at this, this is a great example of where you've got a formal supply chain, lots of products, labour that's produced in those products or manufacturing facilities, but there will be an informal supply chain, or what I call indirect, where labour is permeating through a supply chain that you're not contracting directly with, or you're embedding further and further into that supply chain. And unfortunately, in the main, that seems to be where we see a lot of the issues going forward. So when we think about how we've mapped our supply chain, what the risks are, when you're doing your statements, when you're doing your procurement strategy, you need to open up your concept of supply chain into the embedded area and have that process for analysing it. The other thing that we need to understand is that you have a procurement process. Most of you will do. Some of you may be procurement already. And there is a standardised approach to how we actually address anything when we're buying, whether it's procuring a service like a catering service, whether it's a manufacturing facility where we're providing services for garments, whether it's a solar panel, and I'll go some examples in a moment. You have a three-pronged approach to really good procurement. That is plan, source and manage. Procurement people should be trained in this. They should understand this really, really well. And what we need to get organisations to think about, what we need sort of organisations to get to the point is where the planning and the managing are the most important parts of addressing modern slavery. I'll explain how that fits right now. So you need a process that talks about due diligence. And there is a 4-step approach to due diligence in supply chains. The first step is to risk assess and prioritise. We talked about that yesterday. I'm going to go through it again quickly in a moment. Then what you need to do is investigate and plan and create your strategy on how you're going to address these issues. So the risk assessment starts to get you thinking about how far you need to go, whether you do need to go further into a supply chain, whether it's strategically important, whether you've got control, whether you need to create more control. The investigation is about understanding what's happening in this place and then starting to think about what criteria you want to put in place in your sourcing strategies. The then important part is then the managing. So it's implementing whatever you've asked for and monitoring and measuring and reporting that you are delivering on what is required. So those of you that talked about FSC, I could see somebody mentioning EcoVadis, audits, standards, validations of recruitment standards, codes of conduct. I see a lot. I've got a code of conduct. And when I pressure clients and say, do you ever audit that code of conduct? No, they never do. So where you have these things that you're expecting organisations and supply chains to comply with, you need to have the mechanisms to review and make sure that organisations are complying with them. And we'll talk about, as I said, we'll talk about audit in a moment. Activity to identify preventions. So you need to think about, I see this a lot with the vulnerability that happens with victims. They may be forced into vulnerability because of hidden fees or penalties in their contracts, or the fact that they don't understand the taxation system. They may be forced into vulnerability because they've had to pay recruitment fees, for example. So understanding what standards you can put in place to prevent that vulnerability from occurring is just as important as the sort of auditing and verification piece. So thinking about the prevention piece is really important. The investigate and plan is about creating those identifications, those weak spots, and also identifying the prevalence and making sure that you can rectify those abuses. So Anna talked through that yesterday, and I'll give you the example of Primark towards the end in terms of some of the remediation activity that went into place to address some of those issues. So when we think about this, we need to think about assessing the risk. So one of the key things here, as we were going through yesterday, is very much understanding your data and understanding in a procurement perspective what you spend on, with who and how much, and what your leverage looks like. I see this again with some clients that come to us and tell us we need to do a risk assessment, but we don't actually know how much we spend. We don't know who we spend it with, and we can't tell you what we buy. It's done very transactionally. So again, some of the challenges you're going to have with trying to implement a lot of the requirements around supply chain management, engaging in this space, is actually going to be fundamentally linked to poor procurement practices. And in a lot of instances, issues of modern slavery occur when procurement practices are not robust when there are weaknesses within those systems. So assessing the risk is that part of that planning stage. You can do this two ways. You can do this in terms of holistically coming in and identifying all your risk, so understanding your strategic spend, or you can actually do this at a category by category level, depending on what industry you're in, depends on how you procure and how your structure it is. So in some instances, you may have category teams. They should be assessing this risk on everything that they're procuring and embedding it into that procurement strategy. What you then end up with is a situation where you need to think about where the data comes from. So when you're thinking about the inherent risk, remember that big supply chain that I talked about, you need to understand the spend, you need to understand the categorization, you need to roughly understand the supply chain, and look at intelligence that's out there. There is a huge range, and I'll give you some examples of that a little bit towards the end, but also the contractual relationship. When I was doing a training course in my early days on sustainable procurement, I had somebody ask me how on earth they were supposed to embed sustainable procurement into what they were doing, when fundamentally they had a requisition placed on their desk on a Monday for goods that had turned up on the Saturday. And the reality is that a transactional relationship will not give you what you need. That's bad procurement at the best. But at the same time, you are not going to address some of these issues. So you may need to think about procurement becoming more strategic in this space if you've got a huge risk. Once you've identified where that inherent risk looks like in the supply chain, you then, you mentioned FSC, you've already got due diligence happening in your supply chain to a certain extent. You may have audits, you may already be doing them. So there may be sort of Achilles audits, for example, ethical business audits, there's SMETA audits, there are all sorts that then can look at how businesses address this issue, and standards. So that starts to get you thinking about reducing the risk down. And then finally starting to then identify that prioritization. So once you understand the inherent risk, you understand the mitigation that you've got in place, you then need to think about how to prioritize that. And that is based on risk, based on strategic importance. And when you look at a lot of information that's given out, it talks about leverage. Actually, it should be more about influence, how you can actually influence the supply chain as well, not just procurement leverage, because we spend a lot of money with them. So information can be gathered from things like your audits, your dedicated questionnaires, your market intelligence, your supplier meetings, pre-qualification questionnaires, specialist support, workshops. There's a huge range that tend to go out within that space. And what you end up with is this idea of those priorities and the heat map. And I introduced you yesterday to then the idea that this then creates the supply chain strategies. So if we start to think about how we take this risk data and turn it into a procurement strategy, we're still in that planning phase. We're still in this ability to understand what we need to do to engage the market. We start to think about all sorts of ways of bringing in interventions. And in your organisation should be a variety of different sizes. You will have all sorts of supply chain interventions. You might have supplier chain engagement events, tender requirements, pre-qualification requirements, contract clauses. You may use framework agreements. You may look at supplier development plans and meetings. You may look at key performance metrics. There will be a huge range in that space that you can understand where you inject modern slavery requirements going through. So let's run through an example of how that could work. So if we were to understand that we have prioritised our supply chain, we found a number of categories that are strategically important to us. There's a big risk. We need to engage the supply chain. So you could be looking for collaborative initiatives, thinking about your supplier relationship management programs, bringing your high-risk suppliers together, running workshops, webinars, conferences to raise the issue and gather that market intel. You may look at supplier relationship management facilities that you have. These are the strategically important requirements you have with suppliers, bringing modern slavery onto that conversation list and making sure that you're really getting to grips with how your supply chain are engaging in this space. Investigating whether there are standards already, whether there are audits, whether there are remediation strategies that you can literally get embed into your strategies going forward, or whether you need to work with industry to collaborate and develop some of these. And I'll give you an example of one in the agriculture industry, for example, the Modern Slavery Intelligence Network. Think about then how you embed those requirements into your procurement strategies going forward. So anyone that is a huge risk that you need to think about is in that big strategic supply chain space. It isn't an ITT question, an intender question. It isn't a pre-qualification question alone. It's part of that bigger strategic development piece, and engaging with both the industry and the supply chain is really, really important. Where you may actually have that amber risk as such, you then need to start thinking about raising those issues. And this is where we're getting into maybe that sort of that bit of the sourcing, where we start to think about, well, okay, supply management meetings are where we need to look at that, set minimum level of performance through tenders and supply selection questions, set metrics on what you're expecting them to do, and I'll give you some examples of those in a moment. And also think about the level of competency. So using things like your pre-qualification, what is the supplier really good at and what are they not that good at? And how can we actually, if we need to get to tier 4 of the supply chain, how can we work with that supplier? If we need to, we may not need to, that might not be where the risk is. So understanding that and putting in that sort of development plan to engage the supplier and improve them is really important. And you may not just do this on modern slavery, you may have other issues like carbon or circular economy or diversity and inclusion. There'll be a range of things that you'd expect the supplier to complete for you. So let's test this out with three key areas. I've picked 3 sort of high-level ones that give you a real influence on an idea about how we can address these issues in 3 very different supply chains. So we all know, or we should do, I'll remind you, the solar panel industry at the moment is booming. But off the back of what's been going on in the solar industry, and we're going to talk tomorrow to my colleague James about just transition, we understand there are huge human rights and forced labour breaches going on in the solar panel supply chain. If you've not read a report yet, read something called In Broad Daylight that was issued by Sheffield University, and they talk specifically about 95% of the world's solar panels contain polysilicon, solar grade polysilicon. And within that, 45% of that comes from the Uyghur region, which at the moment has been declared, the UN have declared it as a huge human rights crisis. You may be familiar with the US actually banning any products or solar panels that cannot prove that they are not linked to Uyghur forced labour. And at the moment, the US is stockpiling solar panels that are entering into the US. The EU might end up with the same situation with their new due diligence. So it's a really fractured and complicated supply chain. You may be hiring catering. You may have a catering service either for your offices or for an event. That's a very different supply chain again, in terms of where some of those risks are. And you may have uniforms or garments. And again, that supply chain looks very different. So if we take this principle and think about how we are addressing these issues, bear with me while I try something a bit funky here. We need to understand, for example, in the solar panel market, what does the market, what does the market look like? So the market structure. We know that in the quartz and in the polysilicon, and we know that there is more than likely going to be some issues with semiconductors, as the main place for that is China. So we know embedded in here, we are going to have a huge challenge with modern slavery. We also know that if I'm an installer, an SME organisation, I literally buy a solar panel from a wholesaler. So my leverage to address these issues is minimal. It's very, very difficult to be able to deal with these issues. So if I was a client, and fundamentally I would be a government client or I'd be a house building client, what I'd want to understand is the weakness in that supply chain and understand where maybe rather than installers buying solar panels, we actually start to think about a situation where house developers buy the solar panels or set up standards. Sorry, I'm trying to write while I'm doing this. You can tell I haven't done a whiteboard for a while. And what's going on in the space at the moment is a company called Solar Energy UK. And they are working globally with the European Union, for example, and government to set some responsible sourcing standards. So as those standards actually get implemented, what you could start to do is think about, actually, we might not increase our leverage by bringing all the spend under our umbrella, for example, we actually might increase our leverage by signing up to this standard, and that's going to be launched over the next couple of years. So that approach is very different. You as organizations are not going to be able to suddenly deal with China's geopolitical issues, but you may start to think, actually, if I've got a very fractured supply chain and I'm a big client, can I either work with a standard like the Solar Energy UK one, or if I'm a big developer, could I actually increase my own leverage through increasing my spend by bringing all of that together? Whatever I need to do needs to be investigated. So that approach would be very different. If I was to look at, say, the catering contract, that's made up slightly different again. So what we start to see in terms of that is that we've got services. So if I was to look at where we have huge risks of modern slavery at the moment, we would have it in potentially UK based in the catering contract. It's a very low paid job that has a huge reliance on a vulnerable demographic. It tends to be women, maybe mothers or elderly in some instances, or very, very low paid and migrant workforce, if depending on where you're getting that catering from. We also know that in the food supply chain, fisheries are a nightmare. You have a huge challenge at the moment in some of the waters in Asia, where people are leaving their homes, going and working on a boat, and basically living there for 3 years, never being paid, never being allowed off, and usually their children. So we know that we've got issues in fisheries. We know we've got issues in agriculture, in the food industry in the UK, also globally. So again, where do I focus? Where do I look at these issues? You've got electrical wholesalers. So again, we get into it's everywhere. And that's what I'm trying to get at. So what we need to think about in our procurement strategy is here, cleaning staff, direct risk to me. What can I do? I can look at labour standards. I can look at pay. I can look at recruitment. In here, in fisheries, you've got MSC. So you've got a fishing category, you've got a fishing responsible sourcing standard. There are responsible sourcing standards in agriculture that you can implement. So you can start to see that when you're pulling a services contract, again, your strategy is different. It's a different idea of what you should be looking at. If we take another example, as I said, the garment industry, we've seen this happening quite a lot. So where we have big brand organisations producing garments, we start to see the fact that they will go directly to organisations like in Bangladesh, one of the biggest producers of garments in that supply chain. And in here, we've got issues with labour in manufacturing. We also have issues here in terms of cotton. And cotton here, again, China and the Uyghur region is one of the biggest exporters of cotton globally, and even the UK government has fallen foul of that. So a similar situation where we have issues with labour standards in catering, we can do the same thing here, especially as in this situation, I am directly engaging with that supplier, so I can set those labour standards. And the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013 was a great example of that arms sort of a far away arm's length approach that organisations take. Actually, when you're creating a relationship from a procurement perspective with these organisations, you need to bring it closer. You need to set those employment standards. You need to set the health and safety standards. And in fact, after Rana Plaza, we saw the Bangladesh Accord come in. In terms of cotton, it is then just asking the question, the sourcing the question. And this is not a quick thing to do. So that supplier relationship management, that engagement thing would be really, really important. And you need to be thinking about that now when we start to understand what's going on in those supply chains. So what I've hopefully either very badly or very well explained to you is that depending on what you're buying gives you a different approach. So in the pack you're going to get, please don't try and read these all in complete details. You can examine them when you get the slides. You need to think about questions that you're going to bring into your supply chain processes, into your procurement processes. What I see is organisations talking about, have you got a modern slavery statement? Tick, thank you, done. I've seen some organisations do, have you ever been prosecuted under the Modern Slavery Act? Bearing in mind, I don't think I've actually seen any organisations themselves yet be prosecuted, although I have seen civil litigation in things like Biffa, the Happy Chicken company in the UK. We haven't got a huge range of organisations at the moment that are exposed to that. So when you're thinking about your pre-qualification, think about questions that really engage activity. What have you done to address modern slavery, either to exceed the Modern Slavery Act? You want to be looking at information that gives you evidence of application of policy. You want to be looking for evidence of collaboration. And remember, this goes back to the risk again that you're looking for. In procurement routes, what you're looking for then as well is not just selecting suppliers who understand these issues, but also then supplying, putting questions in that you can then tie into contracts. So from the perspective of, okay, we've got a supplier who is incredibly great at giving me MSC or FSC or fair trade. I need something in there that's going to show that they have a process to assess that. I need them to talk to me about their labour, what they're going to do to raise awareness in their supply chain. So again, think about the question set, something like, please provide details of what you're going to do in this contract to address the issue of modern slavery and mitigate these issues. And again, this is just an example that you can navigate more when you get the slides of some ideas of how you can develop within this space. Also, what we start to think about is the issue of measurement and whether organisations are actually putting measures in place. When you put your modern slavery statement together, what we start to see is, have you got any KPIs? In most cases, your KPIs are not going to be how many victims you've helped. That's not the way the measuring goes within this space. But what you are going to be looking for is metrics that start to show this change in understanding the supply chain, metrics that really show how deep into the supply chain you've been going. And this all links back to the bits that EJ was talking about in the policy section, in terms of being able to report how much mapping you've done, how much of your supply chain has actual grievance mechanisms that they make available to the supply chain. How much of your supply chain is directly employed and how much of it is via sort of temporary labour. These are all sort of really interesting key metrics that you could think about pulling together and adding in. And again, these are just examples that you can take away when you get the slides. The one thing that I see a lot, and we saw a little bit in there, is this audit question. Where do I audit? How do I get an audit done? There are SMETA audits, SEDEX audits, Electronics Watch are a great organisation. In fact, I think I'm competing with them actually today. They're doing some great work in the public sector on understanding labour conditions in the electronics industry. Achilles do a lot of work in this space, looking at employment conditions on sites. There are organisations now starting to develop a sort of an assessment against 25700. They will emerge over time, I've no doubt. There is a huge range. My only thing that I would say to you is that when you're doing audits, a couple of things. Audits do not equate to due diligence. So audits are a route for you to be able to understand what your supply chain is doing. So if you do decide, and I see this with like SMETA audits, for example, where some people say, okay, I'm going to get a SEDEX audit. And they get an audit and they don't understand what they're reading and they don't understand if something's wrong, what they're going to do about it. So where you are going to use these audits, make sure you understand what the purpose of it is. Make sure you understand that you need to be prepared to act on some things that are concerning you, so that they have remediation processes in place. Make sure that if you need audits internationally, and this is one thing that SMETA does very well, is they have links out into the cultural organisations, into the cultures. They employ local translators or local language speakers. So make sure that when you do actually get the audits programme in place, it isn't us, as in the UK, going off to Myanmar or going off to China or going off to India and auditing. You're working with local communities who understand the cultural differences, because there are huge cultural differences in this space that you need to be aware of. Auditing is one of your supply tools. It's not the only thing. So, you know, if you haven't got the specialists in-house, and there's not lots of them, to be honest, there's not lots of people who understand this well enough internally, you are going to have to invest in employing specialists, whether it's these organisations on here or others that you find. Always make sure that you think about that investment. And personally, I think it's about making sure that you move away from compliance to continuous improvement. So this idea of investigating the audit and understanding what you can put right, not we found something that concerns us, you are no longer working with us as a supplier. And the one thing that I always say when I do a lot of my training in this space is remember Rana Plaza. Rana Plaza in Bangladesh in 2013 was one of the biggest disasters in the garment industry. And a day before the disaster, when thousands of people lost their life and were seriously affected, their future family situation was affected, they were audited and they passed the audit. So audits don't always give you what you need. It's making sure that you are understanding what's being audited. In that situation, they said it was CSR, and there was huge health and safety breaches, including locked fire doors, which contributed to a lot of the problems with people trying to escape once the building was collapsing. Once you understand this, it's important to make sure that you have a process in place for that remediation. And Anna talked yesterday about thinking about those interventions, the remediation and the approach that it takes. Remediation can change from anything to changing processes, implementing standards. And we saw this with Rana Plaza, where after Rana Plaza, the garment industry in Bangladesh came together and created the Bangladesh Accord. And it created a standard for health and safety that needed to be implemented on any building site working in garment industries in Bangladesh. We've seen Primark, who get a lot of kicking for a lot of things, and people perceive that they haven't got very good responses in this space, but actually they were one of the few that actually went in, and I think over the time they've been working on it, they have paid nearly 14 million pounds through to families of people who died, or families who have been left with serious health concerns. They provided them with support and counselling. They provided them with opportunities to think about new jobs if they wanted them. So remediation can be anything from, you know, physical money, but processes that can improve, and also creating industry improvements in this space. And as I said, I think it was last year they worked out that Primark's completed, I think it's about 95% of all of the money they've said they're going to pay has been paid so far. And they've even had new people coming and asking for support, which they are saying they will do. So it's a great case study of how that remediation was given to organisations to individuals who really ended up in a bad situation after Rana Plaza. So finally, and then I'll open it up to questions. The thing that hopefully we've been able to sort of let you think about over the last four days is that when we're coming to address these issues in the supply chain, there is no quick and easy tick box. This might be about an area where we have these huge risks. The industry is not yet ready to deal with it, so we need to create things about partnerships. We need to think about collaborations. This increases leverage. So if not, and the Solar Energy UK example is the perfect one. Everyone is talking about solar panels. There is huge conversations politically about banning solar panels from the Chinese region, and yet at the same time, Just Transition is carbon is pushing a massive increased dependence on solar panels, and China dominates the market. So the Solar Energy UK came together with Europeans, conglomerates, and actually US to think about how to address this. Develop and think about how the market can change. So partnerships are really, really important. Also partnerships amongst your peers. Talk to each other, talk to competitors in this space. This is not competitive advantage. Paying people fairly and making sure that they're not exposed to poor working conditions or enforced labour conditions is not a competitive advantage issue. It's the right thing to do. So talk to organisations that are like yourself, trying to work out how to deal with it. Trade unions are great. ETI are a good another organisation, Ethical Trading Initiative. They do a lot of work country by country, and there are a huge range of NGOs as well. So this helps you to think about how you tackle those problems systematically. And that's what I've been trying to sort of do with the procurement bit. There's a process that you can use, and this is where modern slavery should be fitting into it. And then really, there is not a blank canvas here. You are not starting to think about this from a perspective of nobody's talking about it. Human rights has been emerging as a business thinking for quite a long time. So think and investigate and understand. So where you have those big red risks, you need to do some market intelligence. So in the electronic sector, and Maria, I remember you talking about you're in that sector, you have got risks relating to ICT, into ICT production. Your leverage, if you're a service provider, is probably not going to be huge, but you could actually start to think about the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition. You could think about moving, I think as Anna's talked about, to Fairphone. You could think about backing the best horse that's doing stuff in this space. So there's some great work that there's a report does called Know the Chain, which talks about the supply chains for some of the biggest providers. In agriculture, if you've got food things that you're buying, then you've got things like the GLEA, who are doing a lot of work in the food sector in the UK. There's the Modern Slavery Intelligence Network that does a lot of work in this space. That is again a collaboration of farms and retailers coming together to think about labour standards in the food sector. The waste sector, probably after BIFA, actually came together to talk about how they were going to tackle it. Even China is putting together a sustainable sourcing standard. So you've got stuff that you can go and have a look at. The hotel industry has got initiatives and guidance on what should be happening in those sectors. So whatever you're buying, you are not going to be starting from a clean slate. The key is to do that sort of market intelligence. Walk Free Foundation are a really good one as well. They've got some really good reports on what you can think about. This is quite a short deep dive into what procurement can do. But there's a really good report I recommend you read called Addressing Modern Slavery in Long and Complex Supply Chains. Long and complex titles. I've worked a lot with Alex at the Rights Lab in Nottingham over my sort of 8 years in this space. They do some brilliant work. This is a really, really good report, which luckily we replicate this week in terms of some of the guidance and things that you could be thinking about. But it's a really good lens as well on the way businesses are responding into this. So when you get the slides, you will get a link at the bottom. And then for me, the three key takeaways from today, the three key things that you need to think about are the risk assessment fuels every strategy you put in place around procurement. So heat map, identify your high risk areas. That's the place you start. Your procurement strategies are already being written on other things. This is not about creating a procurement process that is not compatible with or procurement requirements that are not compatible with your existing procurement requirements. So good procurement should be understanding the risk. Good procurement should be doing the market intelligence. Good procurement should be thinking about how you can either improve the market or engage on standards. And then think about the fact that it follows a due diligence approach. So everything that you saw on Tuesday that EJ went through in terms of the key things a business should think about are the sorts of things that you should be assessing in your supply chain. So assess your risk, do the planning, investigate and plan, create your sourcing strategy, implement that by putting the requirements into your ITT and putting it into your contract requirements, and then do your review and continually improve. And the reason I've got this little rabbit in the hair is the way I tend to liken it at the end is you need to be the tortoise and not the hare. It's not a quick burst. It's a prioritization, and in doing all of this, you write your modern slavery statement every year because you can literally report on this systematic approach to how you drive these issues. So I'm conscious that we're coming to time and I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to finish off with a little video that was done by the Chartered Accountancy sort of industry, but I think really does get all organisations thinking about what they should do.
The Modern Slavery Act 2015 strengthens existing UK legislation and recognises that all commercial organisations have a role to play in tackling this hidden crime. There were 5,144 modern slavery offences in the UK in the 12 months to March 2019, but up to 136,000 people are estimated to be victims of modern slavery in the UK. Modern slavery can occur anywhere in your supply chain, in the UK or abroad, in all sectors, in business and in practice. Chartered accountants play a vital role in spotting the signs of modern slavery. Does your accountancy firm or organisation purchase T-shirts or other promotional items to distribute to staff and clients? Imported garments are one of the top 5 products most at risk of forced or compulsory labour. Do you store and distribute goods? A 2018 survey found that 31% of supply chain experts thought that businesses were not taking the necessary steps to tackle modern slavery. Modern slavery can occur in recycling and refuse collection. In 2019, several high street retailers were connected to. Do you know where your tea and coffee comes from? Businesses supplying major supermarkets in the UK have been found guilty of breaching the Modern Slavery Act. If you use third-party recruitment agencies, you could be susceptible to modern slavery. In November 2020, a recruitment agency was found guilty of paying workers only a fraction of what they were due. Is there a risk of modern slavery in your supply chain? Do you know how to spot the signs?
If you feel a little bit like that, sometimes I do even when I do these training courses. Hopefully that's given you a really good overview of some of the things that you can think about. It is a lot to get into a very short space of time, but it is about engaging in your existing governance and thinking about how you can embed and how you need to understand how you can prioritize, if you like, pick out some of those areas where you need to be more strategic. So we've got a few minutes left and I can see some questions. We use EcoVadis ourselves in our supply chain. Are you aware of EcoVadis, how it sits our modern slavery? When I was talking about audits, there is EcoVadis is sort of a pre-qualification. They do some investigations into supply chains. They're very management focused. So a lot of the questions that they ask are very much about, have you got the right processes? Have you got the right policies? And it's not as deep as something that's specifically focusing on modern slavery, but it's a good place to start. It isn't a worker voice audit, though. It doesn't necessarily talk to workers. So it is that idea of making sure you're understanding what you're using them for. If it's a management system audit, if you like, that looks at how your supply chain has put processes in place and policies in place, a lot of them are sort of equally competing, not necessarily much better than each other. And a lot of it is desktop as well. So not necessarily asking suppliers and diving further into it. So it's a good place to start. But my word of advice when as I said, with the audits, is have a look at what EcoVadis have asked and does it fit what you need? Sarah, I think that's the best way to do it. Sourcing standards, what are the best ones and which are the worst ones? There are so many of them. I mean, the main ones that we all know. FSC, as I said, is probably one of the better ones because it does look at the social, economic and environmental aspects of sustainability. Included in there is Indigenous rights, human rights, labour conditions. So that's probably one of the best ones that I've seen, and that actually has a chain of custody. A weakness I see in the use of that, though, is organisations who don't actually, they just take the FSC as a tick and think it's done. And they don't actually even ask for chain of custody certificates. They don't even ask for information and validation. The sourcing standards are important because they stop you needing to go and audit, but you still need to look at that information. So I say that's one of the better ones in terms of FSC. Fair trade does something slightly different. It's not particularly environmental focused, quite a lot on human rights and fair pay. But there are challenges with that as well. There's been a lot in the cocoa industry at the moment on the use of fair trade and the corruption in certificates at operational level. Nestle have done some really interesting work in this space, trying to understand how it works. Tony Chocolonely are another one that are trying to understand how the fair trade system could be exploited. So I can't give you an exact ones. If there's ones that you want us to have a look at, my key is to go and have a look at the evaluation criteria and make sure it fits what you need. What do you think is the most important practice? Worker voice audits. Yes, I mean, if the best practice compliance in this space, yes, management audits are a really good place to start. Worker voice does need to be considered all the way through it. And there are some organisations that we see, like Hope for Justice, Slave Free Alliance, that do a lot in that space. Unseen do a lot of stuff in that space, and they know how to speak to individuals on site. It's a growing area, so I'm very familiar with people like Achilles that are going and doing worker surveys. I'm also actually really aware of businesses doing it themselves on top of having just general conversations. So training their teams to talk to people on sites. And there's even a really good app called the Just Good Work app, which is currently used in agriculture, which is an app that workers can download, and it gives them intelligence on their workers' rights. And actually you can ask questions to the supply chain. It won't give you specific examples, but it will give you ideas of what's going on in that supply chain.
And just to note, I probably need to wrap up.
Yeah, no problem. Now. No problem. Thanks, Gemma. Yes, the slide deck is not a problem. Modern slavery statement does need to be available on the home screen. Really, really easy to find. So yes, that is correct. And one click is ideal. So you do need to make sure that. And if you could focus on one industry, food, garments, catering, cleaning, wherever your biggest impact is, focus on that first. So I would say, don't forget your indirects. Catering and cleaning are big problems. Catering would include food. Garments, if you're buying things with your logos on it, or if you're buying PPE, I think that probably should be a longer term, but there is things going on in industry in that space. So if I was to prioritise, I'd probably say cleaning and catering, catering including food, and then garments behind that, depending on your structure. That would just be high level, though. It just depends on how much you're spending and how important that is to your requirements. As Gemma has kindly pointed out, we've run out of time. Apologies, we need to dive off a little bit earlier on this one. If there are any more questions, please feel free to pop them in. As we've done with the others, we will make sure that you get answers. And tomorrow is the last day. We will hopefully see some of you tomorrow, and it's not me talking, so we're pleased to know, but we've got some brilliant speakers talking about just transition, ESG, and sustainability, and where modern slavery sits in all of that. So from me, massive thank you. Hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see